and we post them to, we have a YouTube channel, so just let everybody know that. And with that, I'd like to get started. Welcome everybody to the Native CDFI Network's weekly Friday call check-in. And this week, like every week, we have some great guests, and our guests this week are from the Federal Reserve Board. We have Joseph Fershing and Casey Lazar. And I'm really happy they joined us in a time. We are going to discuss a couple timely items with them, and then we're going to we have another item that we'll talk about I guess within the Native CDFIs about the upcoming changes that they're doing. So with that, I'd like to ask Pete Upton if he has any opening words.
Yeah, I just want to thank our guest today, and thank you, Jackson, for putting the call together. And I'm looking forward to learning more. It's been a topic that's been discussed, in your webinars for the last 9 months. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. And just remind our folks, the Native CDFI Network is the only member organization for Native CDFIs, and our purpose is to represent our membership. And so thank you for being a member. Thank you for engaging with us, and thank you for joining us every Friday. Here's a quick overview of what we want to do today. We want to start off with our guests from the Federal Reserve and talk about the Community Reinvestment Act. And this is something that we've talked about extensively earlier last year and then this year, mostly with the Office of Comptroller of Currency. And then, so that'll probably take about 2/3 or 60% of our time here. And then we have a few other things to talk about. The CDFI fund certification revisions. There's a couple of things we're going to talk about there that our members are concerned about, and we want to make sure that we're responsive. And then finally, any other announcements. So with that, while we have everybody's attention, I thought it'd be good to bring back this slide. We put this slide together back in February of this, I think it was, yeah, February of this past year. And what is the CRA, just to jog our memories? So the Community Reinvestment Act was created in 1977 in response to redlining, where banks would avoid doing business in certain areas, mostly minority and low-income areas. And so the CRA has been something great. However, many Native CDFIs have pointed out, and we pointed out in the past, that there were some areas where it did not fit Native CDFIs and Indian country more broadly. And we pointed those out in our comments to the Office of Comptroller of Currency. And we've had a good chance to talk with the Fed. The Fed's been really interested in what our members have to say, and we're glad they're joining us here. And we want to make sure that they're able to hear directly from the 70 Native CDFIs across the 27 states. So thank you for joining us. And hopefully any new CRA updates by the Fed will help encourage and promote investment in Indian country and Native CDFIs more specifically. And fortunately, both the folks we have today are folks who know Native CDFIs very well, and the CDFIs more broadly. So I'd like to introduce Casey Lazar. So Casey is head of the Center for Indian Country Development at the Minneapolis Fed. He's also an enrolled member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and he is based out in Montana, even though he's with the Minneapolis Fed. So he's got great views this summer right now. He's also a father of 4, and really, his background prior to joining the Fed was also in education, and I know he's served on several boards, including the NB3, the Notabegay board. And he's got a stellar resume: Dartmouth, Harvard, University of Colorado, Denver. So thank you, Casey, for joining us. And this is his second time joining us. I want to note that. And I'd also like to introduce Joseph Furshine. And Joseph is a Deputy Associate Director for Community Affairs at the Federal Reserve Board's Division of Community Affairs. And he, in this capacity, he leads the board's community development and policy analysis teams to ensure that consumer and community perspectives inform Federal Reserve policy, research, and action. But before that, he comes to us with great experience working with CDFIs. He worked at the Treasury Department, and he's also serves as a adjunct professor. And he went to Stanford, like a couple other folks on the call, like Dave Castillo. So thanks for joining us, Joseph. And with that background, I want to ask Casey, and I'll take the screen off. Casey, to give us an update about the CICD, what you all are doing, and also how you all are leaning into the CRA, and then after that, we'd hand it off to Joseph.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jackson, for inviting the Federal Reserve to the Friday call this week. I know I engage and our team engages with tribal leaders and tribal organizations on a daily basis in our role leading the Center for Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve. And it's quite often that tribal leaders around the country talk about, over the past 8 months or so, talk about these Friday calls and how important they are to accelerating conversation, increasing dialogue about what's working, what's not working, challenges, barriers, solutions in Indian country. And so I just wanted to thank you, Jackson, for your leadership of putting these on. They're really, really important to Indian country. Before I dive in, I just also wanted to note that my colleague at the Center for Indian Country Development, Jim Colomb, is also on. Jim and I joined one of the Friday calls back in April, so it's nice to have Jim on as well. So I wanted to give kind of just an overview of what CICD has been working on and a little bit about our strategic vision and our plan for engaging in a CRA discussion and seeking both providing awareness about CRA modernization as well as encouraging some feedback over the next 120 or so days from Indian country to make sure that we're collecting all the voices and perspectives of Indian country so we can do, help accomplish the goal of CRA, which is really addressing financial inclusion for low and moderate income communities. And then we'll turn it over to my colleague at the board, Joseph, to walk through some of the details and technical aspects of our ANRP that's under consideration right now. So as you might remember, if you were on the call in April, the Center for Indian Country Development is the Federal Reserve's research institute that's really designed to address some of the data deserts that exist in Indian country to help sort of remove the description that sometimes plagues Indian country being sort of asterisk nation, right? So we know that oftentimes tribal communities and American Indian people are not included in studies or in data sets, and we're trying to address that through really thoughtful, strategic, applied research on critically important issues that will help Indian country reach its full economic potential. We've been around for 5 years, and before being a formal center, the Minneapolis Fed and a couple other reserve banks, as well as the board, have engaged in Indian country, mostly around legal infrastructure development and CRA. So we have a long track record working alongside Indian country. We've had a lot of our initiatives really been based in education, access to capital, and tribal home ownership. And as we're looking at, coming up and closing our 5th year of our strategic vision, we're going to be doubling down in the next few years on more research and more research that has an anchor into policy discussions related to very specifically to access to capital. I think when you look at economic development in Indian country, there are some barriers that exist that are quite diverse, from issues around legal infrastructure and land use and how we leverage trust lands and so on and so forth. But we really feel like to propel Indian country forward, Indian economic and community development forward, access to credit is absolutely critical, and access to affordable credit. And so this is more of just a heads up that we're going to be doubling down, doing additional research. We've got a few new team members on board that are going to help us make sure that our research is alive, that it doesn't live on a shelf, that it is really designed in a way where there is a tribal voice and tribal implications in all the research that we do. And so every research project that we do will have a policy consideration to help inform both our tribal leaders, our tribal communities and tribal business leaders, as well as elected leaders around the country, our federally elected officials, state officials, local officials, etc. So we're really excited on putting even more emphasis into this topic of access to capital. In that same vein, as you mentioned, Jackson, in your opening slide, the Community Reinvestment Act was really put in place to ensure that there's a promotion of financial inclusion for diverse communities, for low and moderate income communities, and absolutely including Indian country. We know that when you look at the census tracts that are CRA eligible, there's a higher proportion of Native Americans in those census tracts. And so you can see there's a particular opportunity to really leverage CRA in ways maybe we haven't in the past with our banking partners to incentivize and motivate investment and development in our tribal citizens, tribal businesses, and in our tribal communities. So we're really excited to be partnering with other reserve banks around the Federal Reserve System. Certainly excited to be partnering with Joseph and the Board of Governors. I think it's been actually probably one of the highlights of my time with the Federal Reserve to see our Board of Governors, Chair Powell and our Board of Governors, really calling out Indian country and saying, what can we do differently for Indian country? How can we include Indian country in a really meaningful way? And I think the design of the NPR really was inclusive of our tribal communities, and you'll see that in the NPR if you take a look at. One sec. Alexa's chiming in. It sounds like.
I can't hear, so I think we're okay on this side. But.
Okay, and so I think the board is leaned into country, leaned into our team at the center, and we have designed a pretty aggressive outreach plan for building awareness about CRA and really engaging on collecting some perspectives. Because I really think for us to modernize CRA, it needs to have the voice of all folks, including Indian country. And so we're partnering right now with NCAI for their conference in mid-November. We'll have a panel, and hopefully one of our governors will be able to join us on that panel. We are looking at a couple different national listening sessions, tribal consultations, as well as building out some regional dialogue. We'll have regional meetings on CRA to make sure that we're getting a kind of diverse set from Indian country of perspectives so your voices are heard. And we'll also be conducting some one-on-one and small group discussions to collect some feedback. We know that there's a few areas, and Joseph will kind of go into these, but a few areas that are particularly of interest to Indian country that we know that the Native CDFI network provided some voices, some perspectives on the OCC's ANPR that they put out, particularly around sort of the assessment areas and being inclusive for Indian country, ensuring there's some transparency on qualifying CRA activities, ensuring that there's community voice and the community input for lending institutions, CRA strategic plans, and then really trying to figure out how to incentivize and motivate investment in CRA activities in Indian country. So we'll be thinking about it from those perspectives and really seeking some input, some direct input from tribal communities in those areas and other areas that you can see in the NPR. So I'm really excited about the direction that we're going, and I guess my ask to you all is to tell folks in your community, your tribal governments, tribal businesses that you work with, tribal citizens that the ANPR is out there, and to maybe shepherd some of their perspectives through you, so you can provide some of those to the Federal Reserve. So with that, I will turn it over to Joseph to walk through some of the details.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Casey.
Thanks, Casey. Can you guys hear me okay?
Perfect.
Awesome. So first of all, it's a real honor to be here, and hopefully this won't be the last time. As Jackson said, I have a history of working with CDFIs. I think I might have been employee number like 10 at the CDFI fund back in 1997. And I was running the CDFI program and worked with Roger Boyd when he was doing the Native American CDFI program there. And just, really excited to see how much, Native CDFIs have grown, and hopefully can continue to do so. So what I was hoping to do with today is, CRA can be such a detailed topic, and I'll just admit to you guys, I've been working on the CRA advanced notice of proposed rulemaking for the last 2 years, so I've really gotten a lot of information on CRA, but I don't consider myself a CRA expert. I'm more of a CDFI person, and there's some overlap there, but we have a team of experts, and so we've been working really hard to try to come up with some ways to modernize CRA. I mean, it's amazing, but the last time the CRA regs have been updated was 1995, before the internet was even invented, I think. And so, there's a bunch of ways that CRA we think needs to be modernized, and we can talk about all that. But if I had a single message for you, it's just to reiterate what Casey said, which is that, we at the staff level and at the board member level really, really want to do more to encourage and to incent bank activity in Indian country. And we've tried to come up with some ideas on how to do that in this ANPR, but I wasn't familiar with the whole protocol of what an ANPR is compared to a notice of proposed rulemaking and a final rule. But the way to think about it, it's the first stage of a process. It's mostly asking questions about approaches, and then we get the answers to those questions from stakeholders, including you guys. And then we turn that information, that feedback, into something a little bit more detailed, which we'll call a notice of proposed rulemaking, or NPR. So really the main message for you is we've thought of as many things as we could to really incent activities in Indian country, but we're asking, is there more we can do? Have we done enough? Can we do other things? What are the right trade-offs? And we think there's a lot of expertise on this call, and perhaps there's some additional things. And I also want to thank Casey and his team. They've been just a tremendous resource for us. We're fortunate at the Federal Reserve to have a center like his, where we can really get some expertise based on like decades of consultation. So hopefully we can continue that process. Just one other disclaimer we always have to give as Fed staff. So I'm speaking for myself and not for the board members or for any other Reserve Bank. But I will say that the document that I'm going to be referring to, and I'll share with Jackson after this call some links, and he can share them around with you guys, including a link to the ANPR and information on what you can do if you want to comment. But I'll be speaking for myself. The only other thing I will say is I'm hoping we can take some questions. The process that we're in now that we're in an open rulemaking, is if you want to have provide feedback now, that would be great, and I would encourage it. But if we do get feedback on the ANPR, then there's a process in order to be transparent with the public about who we're getting feedback on outside of the formal comment process. I would just have to note that we had this call today, and I would just note at a high level the feedback that I got without attribution to any person. So I just wanted to sort of throw that out there up front. If it's just clarifying questions and things like that, it doesn't require the notice. But if it's, if you're telling us, hey, you should do this differently or whatever, then as part of our transparency rules, we'll do that. So what I wanted to do a little bit is three things really. One, share a little bit about what our goals were for the ANPR more generally. Two, talk about what it specifically does related to Indian country and CDFIs, which is there's an overlap with this audience. And then finally talk about the process for submitting comments. So, so basically, the high level point about where we are in the process is that on September 21st, the Board of Governors voted to approve this advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And we are waiting for it to be published in the Federal Register. It's on our public website now, and I'll send Jackson the link so you can all have it. But we expect that it's going to be published in the Federal Register as early as Monday. And as soon as that date is, as soon as it's published, then it'll be 120 days from that date. So we think it'll be sometime in February of 2021 that the comment period will end. So again, I just encourage everybody to comment. The other thing that's very unusual about the moment we're in is that CRA is a regulation that's administered by three banking agencies: the Fed, the Office of Comptroller of the Currency, and the FDIC. And unfortunately, right now we've diverged a bit. And so the OCC has published, I think it was in May of this year, a final rule on their own. The FDIC, well, they signed on to the NPR, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. They were not party to the final rule. And then we're just now coming out with this ANPR. And so it's a little funky. But as we state in all of our materials, and as Chair Powell said, and all the other board members said, we think it would be the best possible path would be if the agencies could get together on a common frame so that all the banks, regardless of what kind of charter they have, would have the same, same rules apply to them. And, we think that because this ANPR has a long common period and it's based so significantly on the feedback that we heard from stakeholders, where our hope is that there could be widespread agreement on it, not just amongst the stakeholders, but also across the agencies. So that's our aspiration. So let me just talk about a few things about what it does in Indian country and also for CDFIs. So, and I'll do my best not to overwhelm you with detail, because I find that CRA always has that risk of like making your eyes glaze over. So the first one is on the retail side of CRA, which is the rules that apply to mortgage loans, small business loans, and small farm loans. We ask for feedback on broadening the retail definitions so that any retail activity in Indian country would count without regard to a bank's assessment area. Because we've heard, and I know Jackson, when you and I spoke, you talked about this as well, but there's a challenge where banks, lots of Indian country areas do not have bank branches on them or near them, and so therefore sometimes it's not in a bank's assessment area, or at least there's some question about that on the part of the examiner or the bank. And so, the first thing we propose to do is to ask for feedback on saying if it's a retail activity and it's in Indian country, it should count without respect to where the bank's assessment area is, which is the geography that banks normally get assessed. So that's one pretty important thing. And then the other side of the ledger, away from retail, is what we refer to as community development activities, things like loans that a bank would make or in grants a bank would make to a CDFI, or any kind of community development service or activity that involves, say, a bank board, volunteer activity, that kind of stuff. We're saying for CD activities that, again, similar to on the resale side, that if it's in a designated area of need, including in Indian country, then it would also be eligible regardless of the bank's formal assessment areas. So both on the retail side and on the community development side, we think that we would basically decouple Indian country from this narrow focus in the past on assessment areas and basically give banks the certainty of knowing that they could get credit for it regardless of their assessment areas. The other thing we've sought to do is to provide a lot more clarity and incentives for bank investments in CDFIs. We heard from stakeholders that sometimes examiners would be asking CDFIs for proof that some activity that they did was sufficiently low income or that it was sufficiently community development oriented. And we know that banks, or excuse me, CDFIs already have to jump through a lot of hoops to get certified by the fund. And so what we're saying in this ANPR is that if a bank is providing a transaction to a CDFI that's in a bank's assessment area, or in the case of Indian country is in Indian country, then they don't have to. There's no documentation required other than showing that you're a Treasury certified CDFI. So we think that should help with the examiners not having to ask for further documentation. But the more important thing, and this overlaps with what I said before about Indian country, is we're asking for feedback on giving a bank credit for activity that they would do with the CDFI, again, regardless of the bank's assessment area. So that if a bank wants to provide a loan or a grant to a CDFI that's far from where it has a physical branch, where the bank has a physical branch, they could get consideration of that either at the state level or at the institution level of the bank. So that, again, the goal of all this stuff is to provide incentives and clarity for banks to know that they can get credit for activities with both CDFIs and in Indian country, regardless of whether it's on the retail side or the community development side. And then the last thing I'll say is we've heard a lot of talk about, and I'm sure this is familiar to those of you that work in rural areas, but we heard a lot of talk that there's just a lot of incentives right now for banks to just do what's easy and to do things in bigger cities that are within proximity to where they have a lot of branches. Sometimes this problem is referred to as credit hotspots and deserts. And so, you have a place that's a big city, like say Washington, DC, or Los Angeles or San Francisco, where banks have a lot of branches, and therefore they're falling over themselves to try to serve those areas. And then you don't have to go that far away. I'm from California, as Jackson mentioned. I'd gone to Stanford, and I think about the Central Valley of California, or even a place like Fresno or Sacramento that's considered far enough away from Sacramento and LA where banks just don't serve those places very much, let alone a very rural place. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how we could provide more ways of dealing with these so-called deserts. And so one thing we propose to do in the ANPR is, and this gets a little technical, but right now, the examiners look at what we call full scope and limited scope exams. And generally we do full scope, which is complete exams in a big city, but more limited scope exams in rural areas. And we're proposing to do away with that distinction and basically provide the same level of review, regardless of whether it's a big city or whether it's a more of a rural area, a limited scope area. So we think that should help with the hotspot and desert problem. We heard a lot of confusion from stakeholders about where will banks saying, where will I get credit if I'm doing an activity outside of an assessment area? Where will I actually get credit for that? And so we provide a lot of clarity in the ANPR about if the activity is outside of the assessment area, showing where it would get credit, whether it's at the state level or at the institution level, but just making sure that it would count. And then a few definitional things where we've expanded what counts for rural areas related to community development services. And I can go into details on that if you want during the Q&A. And then finally, there's a lot of talk, and the OCC should get some credit for this, is they were very eager to try to provide more certainty around a metrics regime. And by that, I mean giving banks and all the other stakeholders much more open clarity as to sort of how much of an activity is going to be enough to qualify a bank for a certain rating, like satisfactory. And so we've also employed a metrics approach in this ANPR. And one of the things that we're seeking feedback on is the way the metric that we've designed, it calibrates based on local conditions to try to take away the pressure that banks are under to just do the easiest and the largest deals. And so we, and I can get into detail on how we do this, but we try to give a lot of incentives for banks to do smaller deals and do deals in places that aren't necessarily big cities again. So it sounds like a broken record, but it's like a kind of continual refrain where could we do more in rural? Where could we do more with CDFIs, and where could we do more with Indian country, as well as a few other places that we know have had persistent needs. So I think with that, let me stop there, and hopefully I haven't completely confused you guys with all this detail about all these acronyms, first of all, like ANPR. But hopefully this could be the beginning of a dialogue, and working either through me or through Casey and his team. We just really want to have an open conversation with you guys over the course of this period, not just the ANPR, but hopefully the next stage when we get to an NPR and ultimately a final rule, so that we could really create real incentives for banks to serve Indian country and CDFIs. So with that, I will stop, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Casey. Cool. We have a few folks who raise their hands, and while we're doing these questions, I've launched a poll, and this is similar to a question we asked our members, and we asked our members in April, I want to say, and 76% of them said at that time they did not think that banks that they were partnering with or were getting CRA credit for those partnerships back then. So I'll share the results after our questions. And we have Dave Castillo, who runs a CDFI that works out in Arizona and New Mexico called Native Community Capital. And he's our first person with his raised hand. Go for it, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, gentlemen. I really appreciate your time with us now and previously and in the future. Back in July, we were invited to participate in a session with OCC and FDIC on lending opportunities in Indian country. Really surprised that we got about 85 people on the phone, about 40 different banks. And I wasn't really expecting much from it. I was expecting to speak with, or two, the curious as opposed to the committed. Lo and behold, we got about 9 banks approach us with some fantastic opportunities for investment, which I was really surprised at. There was an article written along those lines in the Wall Street Journal that kind of showed that banks have more interest in economically distressed areas in the last 6 months than the last 40 years, probably owing to the shift in the polls for the national election. So that's really my question. We've got election coming up, and the final rule will be in place sometime after the election, well after the election. I'm wondering if this might embolden us to offer some comments that would really suggest we turn the screws on the banks to do more. I'd suggested just kind of off the cuff on another national call that, Wall Street is doing tremendously well during this time, and Main Street is dying, and, res streets or res roads, even worse than they have been for a long time. So is this an opportunity for us to, beyond the regulations, suggest that the banks double down, triple down, quintuple down on their CRA investments as we get through recovery, and maybe, offer them, if they put in 5 times what they normally would in a regular year, they could get credit for 2.5 years of investment. What can we do, assuming nothing changes, and we have the same administration for the next 4 years, we can expect it'll be status quo or even worse.
Yeah.
But if we get a change in the administration and maybe someone like, Senator Warren becomes the, Department of Treasury Secretary, we should have, a really solid footing to extract what's really needed from banks to recover and help communities thrive. Any thoughts on how we should be thinking about that, given the time frame?
Yeah, definitely. I'll offer some thoughts, and then Casey, if you also have any, I'd love to know what your thoughts are. But I would say, you're right. I have observed the same thing that you've observed, which is there's a lot more interest now on the part of banks, and there's been a lot of public commitments, sometimes put under the sort of banner of economic inclusion or minority inclusion, whatever you want to call it. So I've seen a lot of that, and I think that a lot of the groups that we're normally used to working with that focus on community development have really been utilizing, taking advantage, I guess, of this moment of interest. And I would say, our interest is driven by the fact that we've just been hearing a lot of comments. You know, again, as I said, the reg hasn't been updated substantially since like the mid 1990s. And a lot of people have said that we've worked with, even before this most recent moment, we should just do a lot more. Think about ways of just changing a lot of the incentives so that we don't have this hotspot and desert problem, and that we could really be much more transparent and make it, I mean, like, if a bank has a choice between doing something very easy and doing something hard, I think, you know, we really just need to be mindful of giving them the appropriate incentives to do the hard thing, because sometimes it's harder to go out places where they're not, you know, that they don't have physical branches near. So I would say definitely do that. And then as far as, you know, the election is concerned, I mean, one of the things that's nice about working at the Fed is, you know, we tend to be, you know, so the Fed chair is, you know, obviously appointed by the president, but Fed governors are appointed to 14-year terms. And so we tend to operate under sort of longer time horizons. And, you know, so our goal is to make, you know, work with our agency peers to make CRA better. And hopefully, regardless of what happens with the election, that can happen. But I don't know, Casey, if you would add anything more to that from your perspective.
Yeah, and I think this will probably come across as super obvious, but you know, the Center for In-Country Development, since the beginning of the pandemic, has, and you may have seen, has initiated a number of surveys in Indian country where we were concerned that Indian country would be ignored as it relates to the economic impacts of the pandemic. So we've done 4 different surveys over the past 6 months, and as you can imagine, the economic impacts are substantial. You know, looking at it from the perspective of tribal enterprises, I think there are 30% of the tribal enterprises that we surveyed that saw revenue declines of more than 80%. Likewise, you know, we partner with the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development on a survey of tribal businesses, tribal member-owned businesses, and we had over 400 respondents in that survey, and found that just 20% of those tribal businesses had cash on hand beyond keeping their operations beyond 3 months. And so we know that there are significant capital needs right now, and probably, you know, probably it likely could get worse as the pandemic goes on, as it's certainly what we've heard anecdotally. And so as it relates to doubling down and tripling down and quintupling down, I mean, I think there's going to have to be accelerated engagement between banks and lending institutions and partnering with native CDFIs to ensure that Indian country is actually part of economic recovery. And I think we've sort of experienced the same thing that you called out, Dave, is in the sense that there has been increased collaboration, increased dialogue between lending institutions and tribal communities and low and moderate income communities. You know, for some obvious facts of existing debt, there had to be a wide range of conversations around covenant relief, around mapping out credit and debt over the next several years. And I think that's created some stronger relationships in Indian country. I think there have been some stronger relationships that have happened or have been initiated through the PPP program, as many tribal businesses, tribal communities were engaging with lenders maybe for the first time to try to access some of those relief dollars. So I think there's some positives in that, in the sense that there's more coordination and collaboration that's happening. And I think as we're envisioning kind of the modernization as Joseph has detailed, and trying to be more inclusive and be more thoughtful about what's going to really motivate and incentivize investment in Indian country, we're gonna see more folks coming to the table to figure out sort of how can we do this. And I think that, you know, the fact that we're going through CRA modernization right now might lend itself to even more change. I think that could be positive for Indian country as we think about economic recovery. So, absolutely, I think we're gonna need to see, for our tribal communities, we're gonna need to see more investment. And however this however we can get some feedback from Indian country to help us shape the rulemaking for CRA to make sure that happens, I think that's going to be a good thing for all of us.
Great. Well, thank you. And I want to allow some time for other folks to ask some questions. As I think a timely question from Dave. Looks like Christopher Coburn has a question. Muskogee. You might be on mute, Christopher. The Bluetooth thing. That's what's going on. But while he's getting set up, I want to share the poll results that are up there. So it looks like more folks. I think we have more engaged folks on the call, and I guess more engaged sample than we did for the April. And let's see if Christopher, is your mic working?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you all for being on here. One of the things I can see from, I chair a committee called Organizational Development, but it's kind of how we as leaders get ourselves organized or get the tools we need to do our jobs better. And one of the things I see, Tulsa Metro is in our reservation area. We've got a lot of large banks that might do business in Oklahoma, which is in our footprint, but we are not on the radar conversation for CRA. They've been doing that inner city. They've been doing it other ways. What we really need to develop, whether that's something NCN does or we do in partnership with Center for Indian Country Development, is a toolkit to explain to them why they need to invest in our areas, and get that conversation started. I'm excited for Dave, but that is not happening for us. We're only 6 years old. And some even have confusion on tax donation, on if they do an investment in the form of a donation. A lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us are IRC 7871 nonprofit corporations, which is the same as a 501c3, but maybe their governance and documents are so restricted that they only are giving and investing in 501c3. We are exactly, from a tax standpoint, the same thing. But how do we get that conversation going? Is there a toolkit we could provide to show and create documents so we can find that out? The other thing is, do you know who the CRA contacts are at all these banks? And is that public, or we could make that public so I can go chase and contact them and tell them what we're doing good in their area? And everybody else in NCN needs that toolkit too. So both like a database of who the CRA contacts are, and how do we get them to where we know what's going on.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to give it a shot. So first of all, both of those are great suggestions on the toolkit. And even the thing you were saying about the 501c versus the other thing that's just like a nonprofit, but bank might have restrictive rules or just don't understand. Yeah, we should facilitate that. That feels like, I mean, nothing's easy in this business, but that feels like doable. And then on the CRA contacts, we should be able to get that for you. And then the other thing we can give you, and I'll work through Casey on this, is at each one of our 12 reserve banks. So all you have to know is what district, a particular bank is in. And we can give you, we have a map that shows, where the district boundaries are, but we can give you the CRA and community development contacts at each of our reserve banks so they can work with you to make those, to facilitate those kinds of connections. It's like, shame on us if we can't make those things happen. So I don't know, Casey, if I'm speaking out of turn here, but it seems like that's doable.
Yeah, I definitely think it's doable. This Center for Indian Country Development has kind of plotted out a series, a CRA series, just seeking some essentially some CRA stories from Indian Country, Christopher, to really underscore the suggestion that you made in terms of a toolkit of why to invest in Indian Country. This would be more of a why to invest in Indian Country and evidence of lending institutions getting CRA credit in their investments in Indian Country. And I think that that those examples can be really, really powerful. We've written a couple pieces over the years that have really looked at CRA in Indian Country and the role of native CDFIs, et cetera. So I think that would be a sort of an add-on and a complement to some of our previous work. The other, as it relates to 7871, I know First Nations Development Institute put out a couple pieces in the early 2000s on 7871, and that's something our staff at the center sort of underscored as we were going through strategic planning, strategic visioning. is to make sure that there's some education about what a 7871 is, and knowing that there's a lot of 7871s that have experienced some of the things that you mentioned, Christopher, in terms of not being able to access the type of resources just because of the particular IRS code distinction. And so I think there is also an opportunity to increase some education in that space for potential investors in 7871s.
Thank you.
Great. And unfortunately, I think we're going to have to wrap this up. But before,
Hey, Jackson, I
before we
had
do-
I had one more question for you. Hey, you know, one thing that we ran into a number of years ago was that the bank that we were working with, we went through all the steps and all the hoops to get, you know, the application in for a CRA credit. And then it was presented to us that your asset size was not sufficient. And is there a point of entry before you can get into your asset size has to be X? Is that anything written in the statutes there?
No, not that I'm aware of. So in fact, I mean, I think it might be just that a lot of banks have kind of come to realize that it's just easier to do bigger deals than smaller deals. And so they might have their own internal reasons for that. But a lot of what we tried to do in this ANPR was think about ways to counteract that natural tendency. So no, there's no CRA rule that says you have to be a certain asset size in order to get a bank investment. And you know, the fact that you guys are a certified CDFI, I think should help. But yeah, happy to look at the circumstances behind that and maybe dig into it a little bit, but I can't think of any reason why a smaller entity or an entity with smaller assets shouldn't get an investment.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for that question, Pete. And again, Pete's our board chairman from Native 360 Loan out in Nebraska. We've got one more question from Andy Gordon, who's out in Phoenix. And Andy, you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Jackson. This is Andy Gordon at Arizona Multibank, a division of Clearinghouse CDFI. Hi, Joseph. Good to see you.
Great to see you. Yeah.
Joseph and I go back before his marriage and kids. How old is your oldest now?
Yeah, she's 14. Yeah, so it's been a while. Yeah.
So I have a question. There's a working group at Native CDFI Network on seeking a new market tax credit set aside for Native CDFIs, much like NACA grew out of the programs of the Financial Assistance Awards. And I'm just wondering how, because the regs for you, CRA Modernization, will be probably before any set aside is created. But the question is, how do we get banks to see the awards that Native CDFIs get to induce them to be involved with it, maybe by leveraging other bank dollars? So could there be a multiplier of some sort to induce banks to do more in the to marry up to the CDFI awards or allocations? In particular, new market tax credits in Indian country might be smaller, and how do you induce banks to purchase them at a higher price than normal? So if they get a boost in CRA, they may in fact buy those tax credits. There's someone behind you. I see someone.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to take yourself seriously. I'm actually in her room right now, so I can't complain because I'm in my daughter's room.
I love it.
Anyway.
I love it.
Anyway, Andy,
I was just
I hear what you're
wondering
saying.
how we can maybe incorporate where banks can get induced or have a multiplier when they focus on Indian country.
So I will tell you sort of the only program that's more confusing to me than CRA is new market tax credits. That is a confusing program with even more acronyms per square inch than just about anything. But in all seriousness, we have a lot of talk about in the ANPR about trying to create incentives for the most impactful programs. And we have this notion of impact scores. And so I would encourage you, Andy, as you're providing comments and your organization is providing comments on the ANPR, to suggest that one of the criteria for a higher impact score would be doing something in partnership with the new market tax credits, because I think that's a good suggestion, and we're looking for that kind of specifics. So that's one thing I would say. I'm happy to have a longer conversation with you about new markets, as long as you promise not to confuse me too much, but that'd be great.
Well, great, thank you. And I want to pause really quickly, see if we have any other final questions. Got a couple things to get to. Okay, well, great. Not hearing any questions. I want to say thank you to Casey, Joseph, and Jim for joining us. And we'd like to have you guys back again. This is start our discussions about what kind of comments that NCN will put forward. And as always, we encourage our members to put forward comments as well. And we're here to look out for our members. And Pete, you have any final words for our friends of the Fed?
No, just thank you for your time, and we'll have you back again soon. It's good information.
That's great. That's great.
Thank
And
you.
I'll work through you, Jackson, to give you some links that you could share with your members, including once we have the ANPR gets published, I'll send you a link to that and a few other things as resources. I'll try not to overwhelm you, but if you don't mind, Jackson, I can make you our point of contact on that.
Cool.
All right, great.
Thank
All
you.
right, thanks for the opportunity. We really appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks,
Okay.
Jackson.
All right,
Thanks,
bye-bye.
Pete.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Well, great. We have a couple other items we wanted to touch on, and this is something that our board chair and our organizational development chair have been engaged on, and we wanted to start a conversation with our members. I think most folks have heard that the CDFI fund, and actually when we had them on, back when we had Jody Harris on, she mentioned the need and asked us to weigh in on comments on two things that they're asking for comments on. The first is annual certification application and update to that they've published. And the second is two updates to certification reports, the annual certification and data collection report that they call the ACR, and a new certification transaction level report that they're calling the CTLR. And so it looks like some buttons you Control Alt Delete or something. But we want to make sure that we flag this for our members. The comments are due November 5th. We've asked the Treasury to join us, but unfortunately they I guess aren't as they have some rules that prevent them from commenting on rules that are out for comment. So they're not joining us or any other organization on any webinar before now, November 5th, which is unfortunate. So it's a good thing our friends from the Federal Reserve were able to join us. But with that background, we started this conversation last week. I wanted to hear if folks had any other questions, concerns that were raised. I know we had Paula from NeighborWorks who noted that annual certification requirements for CDFIs that do not receive federal funds will become probably a little more onerous, it sounds like. And I know that our board chairman, Pete Upton, has flagged a few concerns like this might be a good opportunity for native CDFIs to address any other rules that we might have issues with, or if we want clarification on anything.
And Jackson, I did visit with Clint this morning, and I've reviewed the document like 2 or 3 different times and reached out to different people. And for the most part, I think it's they're not bad. I don't think there's anything that's alarming by any means, but I would just encourage everybody to take time like this week to just glance through it. And then maybe next week we can visit in more detail about it. But yeah, I just don't see anything that really jumps out at me by any means. So
That way,
yeah.
Absolutely.
the thing that bothers me is that the CTLR, the transaction level report, will now be required for any certified CDFI, whether they get federal money or not. And so every certified CDFI, especially every certified native CDFI, will have to spend the money to buy the software upgrades and do the reporting. That's a big deal to me, because if they don't have cash to work with, extra cash from the CDFI fund, that is onerous. The qualifications for being a native CDFI versus non-native and cleaning that up to make sure that it's not basically a non-native CDFI masquerading as a native CDFI, those changes, I think it will clean up. So it might clean up some non-native CDFIs that are acting like a native CDFI, and get them out of the way of the competition pool for actual native CDFIs. So that's good. But the CTLR, adding that in, we're thankful to be a first-time awardee in our 6-year history. So I'm pumped about it. I know we'll have to do it because we got an award, but we're also going to, anyone else that didn't get an award or got denied still has to do it. That's kind of a big step. So one of the things that I need to know for our benefit, but maybe others need to know, are best practices in doing it, and is this new certification report much more onerous or different than what they had in the past? So I'd like to, create the opportunity for people to discuss at some point in the future or privately with me how to do that best, how to do that transaction report. But I do think it's wrong to make certified CDFIs have the expense to do it if they're not getting the money that you normally went along with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my only other concern too is that the changes are going, this process is taking place during the pandemic and with all the chaos that's happening. Does it really need to be addressed this year? And when will the new, if passed, when will the new regulations go into place? So I visited there, and he's going to get me a date on if it is passed, but when it would go into effect. But I do think, the additional time and money it might take for the new transaction level report, and just making sure that all, there's a grace period of time to transition, and preferably beyond 2021, because when you go, 2020 is going to be just a strange year, for all the different transactions that we've had, maybe deferrals and things of that sort. So the last thing you would want is a new report on top of, some chaos that happened internally, maybe with your loans. And he said those are the things that the CDFI fund needs to hear. And he said they try to think things through, but they, all these unique circumstances, he said, really make a point of it if it affects your organization. So I think it's something like next week, you maybe have a little bit more follow-up discussion on it, then we can put together a letter.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And I agree. And what our board chairman and our organizational development chairman noted, I think is exactly in line with what we want to do. We want to bring in as many comments to the conversation so that we as a member organization are able to best represent and put forward a comprehensive letter. And so we'd ask you to send some comments my way by Thursday of next week so that we can include them in the conversation next Friday. This is our goal. And then I've also shared a link. If you can go to the link, there's a link to the CDFI's Fund's official page on these changes. They have a couple videos on the 2 different changes where they walk it through. And then they also have a couple long PDFs about the changes and the new updated forms. So those are worth looking at. Cool. And I think we're just at the end of the hour. So I know some folks have to go. The news, there really isn't much news on the stimulus. We're kind of at the same spot as before. Folks are still trying to figure it out, and markets figuring it out too. But I think the market is banking on a stimulus package before. And announcements. Reminder that we have our NCN committee nominations open. We want folks to apply, but next week is the deadline. So please apply to join the data committee, organizational development committee, or the policy committee if you have not already. We want everybody. And Dave Tuvey, this might be old, but Dave Tuvey's hiring a loan officer. And I want to pause if anybody else has any announcements while we're still on. All right, not hearing any. I think folks are ready to go. So cool. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Thanks to the Fed, our friends at the Fed, and Pete Upton, you have any final words and send us out? Might be on mute. Maybe he had to go too. But thanks again, everybody. And we look forward to seeing everybody next Friday. And shoot me any notes if you have questions or concerns about the CDFI funds work on the certification. Okay, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jackson.
Hey, thanks, Lisa.